Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the 8,000 Days of Retirement webinar. We're eager to introduce you to our special guest, John Diehl. He is a Senior Vice President of the Applied Insights team for Hartford Funds in connection with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Age Lab. The MIT Age Lab works with businesses, governments, and other organizations to gather insightful consumer-centric data to better understand what retirement means, our longevity, and our financial futures. So that we all do not have to go back to school for degrees in data analytics, I have the pleasure to letting John take the stage. Thanks for joining us today, John.
Thanks very much, Jack, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. So, as Jack mentioned, my name's John Diehl, and by way of background, I've worked for Hartford Funds now for over 36 years. But the last 20 plus years of my career have been spent studying aging, longevity, changing demographics, impact of technology, and changing lifestyles, because in that way we can anticipate needs of future consumers, both financial needs, but really not just about the money. It's really about what we call the infrastructure of aging. And to help us do that, we've partnered now for some time, as I mentioned, with a group at MIT in their School of Engineering called the MIT Age Lab. And just in the spirit of full disclosure, so you all know, if there's any MIT grads on the call today, I want to make sure you all know I did not attend MIT. I like to tell folks I was in the half of the class that made the top half possible, if you know what I mean. But hopefully, over 20 plus years of leading our research with the researchers at the Age Lab, some of what they've worked on has begun to sink in. And that's my purpose today, is to share with you some of our findings, which this presentation that I'm going to give to you today is probably one of the most requested that we do. And my hope is I'm going to share some slides to walk us through our conversation today. My hope is to provide you somewhat of a framework in which to think about the new context of aging and longevity, because MIT tells us that it's very likely that many of us will live what they call 100 good years. And if you think about 100 good years, that was not exactly how retirement was designed back in the 1930s, forward to the 1950s. Longevity is changing everything, and it's changing everything at all stages of life. So today we're going to talk about this topic of 8,000 days. But before we jump into it, I want to share with you a little bit about the MIT Age Lab, who they are, what they do. So as I mentioned, in MIT School of Engineering, there's about 40 researchers, not all engineers, although it is MIT, so engineering is very well represented, but a gathering of engineers, sociologists, physiologists, psychologists, I like to say all kinds of ologists, all looking at that third bullet point: changing trends in demographics, technology, and lifestyle, which help companies, governments anticipate the needs of future consumers, which then influences product design, service delivery, maybe even environments we'll find ourselves in. So let me just give you a couple of brief examples to give you an idea of kind of who the Age Lab is and the work they do. On your screen, you see a picture of a Volkswagen Bug. That's the world's only $2 million Volkswagen Bug. That's because that car is outfitted with all kinds of technology meant to measure driver acceptance of new technology in the automobile. By the way, there is one of those actually physically inside the laboratory at MIT. But if you're ever walking the streets of Cambridge and you see a car riding down the street with that logo on the side, get out of its way. Someone is wired up inside, because they're taking all kinds of data, everything from eye tracking, where are your eyes looking, all the way to skin conductance, how you're feeling behind the wheel. Are you sweating? Are you anxious? And they use this to help design technologies in the car in the future. And to give you a flavor for that, maybe some of you today drive an automobile that's equipped with lane departure warning systems, smart braking, automatic reverse monitoring systems, and the like. You know, many of those technologies were rooted in the study of the aging driver, because as we age, reflexes slow, muscles atrophy, even neck rotation becomes more limited. Now, I don't know about you, but when you're parked in that tight spot, you throw the car in reverse, you can't really see behind you, but the car starts beeping when there are people or automobiles kind of approaching. It saved me from many an accident. Now we know today that Americans are now staying on the road longer and safer than at any other time during history, which is important because if we're going to live 100 good years, we certainly need to be able to get where we intend to go. Another example I want to give you is that the researchers leaning up against that car, you see they're dressed in kind of funny looking suits. What they're wearing is an aging suit. The name of the suit is called Agnes. It's everything in MIT is an acronym. Agnes stands for Age Gain Now Empathy System. I can take any of you listening, regardless of how old you are, we could dress you in the Agnes suit. And we could calibrate what it would feel like to be roughly between 80 and 83 years old. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, why in the world would anybody want to wear a suit like that? And I'll explain in a second, but I do have to give you this precaution. And that is, if you're already over age 83, the suit does not take us the other way. It only moves in one direction. The oldest ever attendee of one of my workshops was a 106-year-old woman. And she came, by the way, because her kids thought it'd be a good idea for her to hear what I had to say. Her kids were 82 and 78. But when she heard we got this suit that we could calibrate what it would feel like to be 80 to 83, she raised her hand and said, Mr. Diehl, where do I sign up? Doesn't work that way, only moves in one direction. But let's talk about how a suit like that would be used. Let's say that you're a major US retailer and you're concerned about the interior design of your stores, that your stores are designed to accommodate an aging US population. What better way than to take the senior management team, dress them in the Agnes suit, dial them up to age 80 and go shopping in your own stores? So when you go to reach for those high volume items that are always on the very top shelves and you can't quite get there, maybe the light bulb goes off in terms of shelving redesign. Those big long aisles that used to hold all the products, you'll notice in some stores now they're not big long aisles anymore. They're broken into islands, which become more easily navigable when mobility limitations begin to creep into the picture. So I wanted just to describe those quick couple of examples. By the way, if you're interested in that Agnes suit, if you're a subscriber to, I think it's Disney Plus that has the National Geographic channel, there's a 6-part series called Limitless with Chris Hemsworth. It's all about aging and longevity. And if you know the name Chris Hemsworth, he's the big guy that played Thor in those Marvel movies. Well, in episode 6 of that series, the MIT Age Lab actually designed a special Agnes suit that Chris Hemsworth could fit into. So if you want to see it in action and you have access to the Nat Geo channel, definitely give it a watch. So what are we here to talk about today? What is the research that MIT has done for us? Well, this is Dr. Joe Coughlin. Dr. Coughlin is the founder and current director of the MIT Age Lab, and he puts our challenge with aging this way. We have a longevity paradox. We've now achieved what we've been trying to achieve since we walked, which is we're living longer. But here's the problem. We don't have a really good idea of what to do with all that additional time. And so today I'm going to talk about the 8,000 days and 4 phases of retirement framework. We'll talk about why 8,000 days is so significant and maybe why it will kind of register with you in terms of thinking about your own planning. And by the way, as I discuss some of these concepts today, my challenge to you is to think not only about yourself and where you fall within the framework, but maybe there are loved ones in your social network. Maybe there are parents or siblings or maybe just friends that haven't thought about this as much as you have. I will share with you one of the things we can offer you is a 4-page white paper that was written by Dr. Coughlin, which is a summary of my comments here on the presentation today that you can feel free to share. And we'll make sure you get that to Jack and your advisors. So, but 8,000 days, what's the significance? We'll talk about how MIT now says there are 4 phases of retirement. And they say most of us will experience at least 3, if not all 4 of those phases. And then we'll talk about how those 2 things together kind of change the way we might think about or prepare for an 8,000-day retirement. So let's talk about 8,000 days and the significance of it. So the researchers at MIT now say that in America, your life can roughly be divided into 4 8,000-day segments. Imagine this. It's about 8,000 days from the day you're born to the day you graduate college, university, exit the armed services, start your career, about 8,000 days. It'll be another 8,000 days from the time you start your career till your first midlife crisis. Now, we say first because we're all living longer. We have time for multiple midlife crises. But yes, about 8,000 days. Now, from midlife crisis to the time that most people say, that's it, I'm going to retire, I'm going to do something different, that too averages about 8,000 days. And the last segment, obviously, no one knows how long that segment is going to last unless your birth certificate came with an expiration date on it. However, on average, when we look at the law of large numbers, you're looking at approximately 8,000 days on average. So if you've already done the math in your head, 8,000 days, just a little shy of 22 years. So you're looking at ages 22, 44, 66, and roughly 88 years old, and shave a little off of that because it's actually like 21.9 years. But as we look at those first three segments, here's the important part about these 8,000 day divisions is that the script has already been written for the first three. We know in the first segment, go to school, get good grades so you can get into the career, university, whatever of your choice, right? And by the way, during that period, you'll have mentors. You'll have parents, grandparents, family friends, so on and so forth. When we hit that second phase, the growing phase, everything during this phase is growing. You'll find your income's growing because your job responsibilities are growing. Your family may be growing, all until that point where we get from our mid 40s to our early 50s, usually, where we turn around and look at that spouse or significant other that we haven't spoken to for 20 years because we've been running to dance recitals, little league fields, soccer fields, and we begin to pause, take a breath, and say, is this what life is going to look like from here on out? But we don't exit the workforce at that point. We're nearing peak earnings years. So we hang in there a little bit. By the way, in that growing phase, you also have mentors. You have bosses. You may have professors, so on and so forth. In that third phase, maturing phase, you again are at your peak earnings years. You're very good at what you do. Work is probably trying to get as much out of you as they can. You also have mentors and coworkers and friends, people, bosses, perhaps. And then one day, you're going to make the decision to retire. And here's the problem. What Dr. Coughlin said in our introduction is that retirement may very well now last, not 5 to 7 years as initially designed, but 20, 25, 30 years. And there's a lot of time to fill in those 20 or 30 years. In fact, let me give you some examples. Maybe there are people like this that you know in your neighborhoods or maybe in your families. Maria Brañas Morera. Actually, she was 117 years old earlier this year, but sadly, I have to update my slide because Maria passed away at age 117. She was living in Spain in or around August 20th or so. She's now succeeded by a woman in Japan who is currently 116 years old. I want to make sure and get her name right. Her name is Tamako Ituka. She's currently 116 years old, but the oldest living documented human being is right next to her, Jean Calment. Jean Calment lived outside Paris, lived to 122, documented all the birth certificates, everything like that. The sad thing about Jean is she may have lived to 128, but at age 114, true story, she picked up the habit of smoking. Now, she dropped it again at 118, but she passed at 122. Catherine Switzer, for those of you who are located in the Boston area, you may recognize that name. 5 years ago, Catherine Switzer was celebrated for finishing the Boston Marathon at age 70. You may say, well, John, probably a lot of people finish the Boston Marathon at age 70. And that's probably true. But what was so significant about Catherine is that 5 years ago, when she finished the Boston Marathon, it was the 50th anniversary. She was the first woman to ever finish the Boston Marathon. So imagine that. Now, she didn't run it every year in between, but imagine she ran it at age 20, and 50 years later, she ran it again at age 70. And if you ever want some interesting history, go Google Catherine Switzer and see what happened when the head of the Boston Athletic Association discovered that a woman was running in his marathon. Spoiler alert, I already ruined it because I told you she finished, but I'll leave the rest of it up to you and your research. And my favorite on this screen, Julia Hurricane Hawkins, the current world record holder in the 100-meter dash over age 100. She's from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She was not happy with the last time she ran it, so hoping to break her own record in the senior games that are upcoming. Folks, my point of this slide is not only are we living longer, we're living better. We're living better because we're now educated about how to take care of ourselves and our bodies. We're living longer because medical science has advanced both at the infant stage of the life cycle and also at the tail end of the life cycle. So that's why MIT believes that many of us will get to, in fact, they would say for babies born today, they fully expect life expectancy to be 100 years. Just to give you where we're at, kind of set the stage today in the United States. If I have two people, husband and wife, married, both age 65, there's now a 50-50 chance that one of the two lives to age 92. Ladies, I probably don't have to share with you who the odds are in favor of there. But when we think about a retirement that may start in our 50s or our 60s and now last well into our 90s, let me ask you a question. Were you the same person in that first 8,000 days at age 3 as you were at age 20? I would venture to say no. And probably if you look at any of those age segments, you would say the same thing. With that long of a span, we're going to change. When we change, circumstances change, needs change, opportunities change. And so what we're looking for is a framework, because the traditional retirement story, as designed, a couple of bike rides on the beach, save up for that trip around the world, squeeze in a few rounds of golf in between. The retirement that was designed in the 1950s as a retirement solely of leisure and relaxation is not cutting it today. Today's retirement story looks more like this. Where are we going to live? What are we going to do? Who's going to work? Both of us going to work? Nobody going to work? What hobbies haven't we gotten to explore yet that we want to? What trips are we going to take? Do we want to go back to school? Do we want to start a new business? Where are the kids? Or let's be serious, the grandkids, right? All these questions are brought up now because of the opportunities that we were provided in dealing with an extended longevity. And so we kind of need a new framework for that last 8,000 day segment. So I want to share with you again what MIT calls the 4 phases of retirement. I'm going to touch on each phase and we'll talk about the significance in each one. So the 4 phases are called the honeymoon phase, the big decision phase, navigating longevity phase, and the solar journey phase. So let's talk first about the honeymoon phase, because that's the one most of us can probably roughly get our arms around, right? This is the phase where we call it the honeymoon phase. All the things you've dreamt of in terms of retirement, they're going to start to happen here. You get control over your calendar. You get to make decisions in terms of where you spend your time and how you spend it, and the people you spend it with. But there are a couple of things that are changing as we look at this first phase of retirement. And probably the biggest change that we see is now the role of work in retirement. Now you're saying, John, we're talking about retirement. You're talking about work. That's an oxymoron. It is indeed. We don't even know what to call people. We call them the working retired, right? It absolutely makes no sense, but we don't know how to describe it. Now, before you get really upset with me, let me just explain. I'm not talking about continuing to work 40, 60 hours a week like we did for the first 20, 30, 40 years of our career. No, as we age, we're going to desire greater flexibility. We may want to only work 20 hours a week and then just doing the things that we really enjoy doing. We're ready to offload the stuff that we never really liked, but we had to do. But folks, we now live in a knowledge economy, right? So people are paying us not just for our physical ability to do things like we did back in the industrialization era, but in the knowledge era, people are paying us for our experience, not only our book knowledge, but our practical knowledge of why we do things the way we do, with a constant yearning to learn new things. And so the role of work is changing. And this is a question that we really need to think about as we think into our retirement. How long do I want to work? What are the working conditions I would design? And by the way, we also define work not just as for profit. You might want to work for a cause that you believe in, a nonprofit, right? Volunteering also counts as work. But if we think about some of the changes, the technological influence, what we're doing right now, we weren't doing this pre-COVID for the most part. But COVID, MIT would say, didn't create new trends. It just accelerated trends that were already in place. And so today, we find that remote work is exceptionally accessible to aging employees. And it gives us the ability, depending on your profession, to perhaps to work from wherever in the United States or around the world, frankly, that you would choose to, as long as you've got an electric outlet and a Wi-Fi signal. And so remote work actually may favor older workers. And the other thing we need to look at when we talk about work and retirement, this is very interesting because sometimes when we talk about working in retirement, people jump to the conclusion, well, John, of course people are going to have to work longer. They didn't do a good enough job saving in retirement. You may be right about that, but typically not in the top couple of quintiles of income. In those areas, what we find is the reason why people want to work is one thing by far, and this comes through in mostly every consumer survey we do. It's that people want to work to continue to maintain their social connection. People want to be relevant. People want to matter. And work is one way that we do this. In fact, I'm going to share with you the flip side of this. MIT tells us there's an epidemic in the United States that was prevalent prior to COVID-19. The epidemic today is situated in the over age 65 male. But ladies, you're not off the hook here. The epidemic is one of boredom, loneliness, isolation, and depression. Why is that? Because oftentimes when a man leaves their primary career, their social network almost immediately shrinks. And again, their sense of mattering, that feeling of self-worth, it's a difficult adjustment, and men tend not to rebuild social networks as quickly as women do. Ladies, as I said, you're not off the hook. One of the things MIT observes is that despite the increasing importance of women in the workforce for, say, the last 60 years, women still retain the title many times of chief operating officer of the household. What we observe is that she will rebuild social networks away from the primary place of employment much faster than he will. So when we look at reasons for working in retirement, want to stay active and involved, they enjoy working, want money to buy extras. By the way, let me just share with you, about 25% of Uber's drivers are over age 50. And in that age segment, the reasons they give for working, money is number 3, much like my chart here, right? What's number 1 and 2? Well, number 2 is if I weren't doing this, I'd probably be sitting around doing nothing, right? I meet people, it gets me out. It actually becomes a little bit addictive. I'd survey Uber drivers all over the United States and talk to people specifically in that age segment about why they continue to work. And the number 1 reason they continue to work, I mentioned it earlier, maybe you caught it, flexibility. I can turn it on, I can turn it off. Not saying you're all going to go out and get jobs driving for Uber tomorrow. Maybe some of you already do. But what MIT would say, the workplace is changing, and it may afford opportunities to work more flexibly to aging Americans because there's a brain drain going on right now, and the country can't afford to lose your expertise. So work opportunities, whether they're volunteering, employing your skills for a cause that you enjoy, they're exploding. More financial help to adult children than from children to aging parents. When this phase begins, you'll notice that you're probably supporting your adult children more so than your aging parents, but at some point, the switch will flip on that. The reason why I bring this up, it's very important as you consider your future retirement plans, is the question, will you ever get the tap on a shoulder to provide care for another? Might be a spouse, might be a sibling, might be a parent, might be a child or a grandchild for that matter. But your role in your family, what role do you play? And if called to provide that role, how would you manage that transition? And so it's one of the things whenever we do studies, people tell us, we'll look at people 5, 6, 10 years into retirement and say, was it what you thought it would be? They would say, honestly, no, right? Nobody told us that 3 years in, his mom would break a hip and she'd come to live with us. Now they'll always say, and actually, it was a blessing we never anticipated. We were glad to be able to do it for her. But again, thinking about that fact that at some point in a family, oftentimes people are going to need care. And what is your role in terms of that caregiving? Lastly, I'm going to tell you in this first phase where the rubber hits the road. And what I mean by that is that, up until now, all the financial projections that you've gotten were just that, projections. But in the first 2 years of retirement, the income becomes reality and so do the expenses. And it takes that long for things to settle out. But I put these stats up on my slide just to remind you about where the American workforce is in terms of their retirement readiness. About 60% of workers expect to receive a traditional pension from a defined benefit pension plan. Sad news, only 40% of her work for a company that offered one. So unless you know of companies that are rolling out defined benefit pension plans, just like the old days, we're guessing these expectations are wildly misplaced. But they'll get corrected, usually in the honeymoon phase of retirement, which moves us to the next phase. By the way, I do need to disclose to you, there is not a set age at which these transitions between phases occur. Your transition, how long you stay in one phase versus the other, is oftentimes determined by three primary resources we all have available to us. One is our physical resource. How's your health? Do you have the health to be able to enjoy and do the things you'd hope to? Number two, your financial resources. Do you have the money to avail yourself of the things that you envision retirement being all about? And three, and the one that is most often overlooked, and I talked about it just a little bit in that last segment, your social resources. How connected are you in your communities? By the way, you know, Harvard as well as MIT now believe that the single best indicator of a long-lived, healthy life, one thing: relationships, relationships, relationships. Your friends do something very important for you as you age. They get you up off the couch, physically moving, giving you a place to go and a reason to be there. And secondly, mental stimulation, a reason to circle the date on the calendar, things to look forward to, challenges to overcome, which again is another reason why work actually plays in there, right? It connects us with people and a fresh group of people quite often. So whether it's, again, volunteering, working, whatever, but eventually you will transition to what's called the big decision phase. And in the big decision phase, there are three big questions that are going to have to be answered. But MIT would tell you these three questions are questions that should be asked by anyone 45 and older, if not about yourself, then about someone that you care about. And I will warn you again, these three questions are going to underwhelm you with their simplicity, given that they come from the rocket scientists at MIT. But hang with me. I'm going to touch on them briefly and tell you why they're so important. So you ready? Three questions that the MIT Age Lab says can predict your future quality of life. Here they are. Who's going to change your light bulbs? How will you get an ice cream cone? And who will you have lunch with? Who's going to change your light bulbs? What's that all about? 90%, that's 90% of us, believe that we're going to age in our own homes. Did you know that the average American moves 12 and a half times during their life, and the majority of those moves occur after age 60? When you think about that, you say, wow, I wouldn't have thought like that. Well, sometimes we decide to upsize. Sometimes we decide to downsize. Sometimes we decide to move to a different area of the country. Sometimes we want to be closer to children, or as I said earlier, let's be honest, grandchildren. Sometimes you want to move away from children and grandchildren. You may need to live with children and grandchildren. You may need the care of a care community at some point in your lifetime. When we look at the average age of people entering into independent living, remember independent living, I don't need a lot of medical oversight, but I'm anticipating maybe a day that I do, maybe my home got too much to take care of. Average age entry into independent living is 83 years old. We are staying in our homes as long as we can, but at some point it may not be practical anymore. So are we giving thought to where will we go if we're not able to stay in our home? And if we do want to stay in our home, do we spend time thinking about what changes, modifications may need to be made to the home to make it livable? So I could share with you top 10 design trends for aging in place, like level entryways, kitchen and bath improvements, storage within easy reach, all of them meant to prevent one thing in the home. What is it? Falling. Because a fall can change the plan in a heartbeat. So evaluating our homes, thinking about housing or where we'll be living as a spectrum, not as a, I'm going to live in this house until they take me out in a box. It doesn't always work that way. So thinking through the living situation is important. That's what's important about who's going to change your light bulbs. How will I get an ice cream cone? If I asked you about what are the small things in life that make life worth living? And if you are to live to an extended older age, you greatly increase the odds that at some point you'll lose the ability to drive. All of us got to experience what it felt like not to be able to access the people, activities, and organizations that make life worth living through the COVID crisis, sometimes that happens to us as we age. The American family has gotten smaller. We live in rural and suburban environments where if we lost our ability to drive, our quality of life would drop almost instantly. And so this question calls into account where is the area that you're intending to retire, and will you maintain access? Do you have walkable access to many of the things we desire, like restaurants, doctors and dentists, entertainment venues, and the like? In fact, one of the fastest growing populations or population centers of Americans age 65 plus are now forming around college and university environments because they have art, sports, culture. They also usually have teaching hospitals, maybe cutting edge medical facilities or technologies, and they offer walkable access to many of the things that we desire. Some of those things that I just mentioned. By the way, in this category, just to make sure kind of you level set here, today in the United States, the average man will outlive his ability to drive by about 6 years, the average woman by about 10 years. That's why transportation and access is so important. Good news, though, here for the guys, because so far the game seems tilted against us. Gentlemen, if you take one thing from my talk today, here it is. If you want to be the Casanova of your senior living community, there's one skill that you want to keep sharp as you age, and it's not dancing. It's driving. And if you can drive at night, rock star status. True thing, folks. We have studied it with MIT, and it's absolutely true. And by the way, it parallels other life stages. Remember back when we were 16, 17 years old, who was the most popular kid in school? The ones that borrowed the keys to mom and dad's car. We piled in, they gave us access where we wanted to go and when we wanted to get there. Lastly, folks, and I've talked about it enough, I'm just going to touch on it here, but your social connections as you age, crucially important. And the thing to think about here is, where are you intentionally putting yourself in a place to meet new people? Because we are social creatures. We need one another and we need to be engaged. And as we age, oftentimes, if we tried to stick to a static social group, we'll find that that group depletes over time just because of mortality. So are we refreshing our social networks with new people, new relationships? These are the big decisions. Will our home be able to accommodate us? How will we access things? And what does our social network look like as we age? Eventually, you'll pass into the third phase of retirement, which we call navigating longevity. This is signposted when someone in the family begins to need a fair amount of caregiving. What's interesting is that up until age 65, we in the financial industry have done things pretty well, right? What concerns people most about retirement? It's the money, the money, the money. How much will I need? How long will it last? How much can I take? So on and so forth. But look what happens after age 65. All of a sudden, money notches down. Health becomes my number one concern. What good is all the money if I don't have the health to enjoy it? And more specifically, over 75, not only is it health, but cognitive decline. What can I do to stay sharp, keep my memory sharp, and continue to participate in all the relationships that mean so much to me? If you've ever been in the role of a caregiver, you'll know that things build up over time. In fact, most caregivers don't even identify themselves as caregivers. They say, this is just what a good son, daughter, brother, sister would do. But what starts out as a couple of calls home to mom and dad, make sure everything's okay, may turn into attending physician appointments together to make sure we're all on the same page, making sure we're keeping track of medications, maybe starting to pay bills, providing transportation, maybe eventually even housing or sheltering my loved one because it's not safe for them to be on their own. So cooking and cleaning, paying bills, so on and so forth. We call it administrivia, but it builds over time and it continues to absorb more and more time. The role of a caregiver is not just making sure that the medications get meted out correctly. It's tree falls in mom and dad's front yard. Who takes care of getting it out of there? We need plumbing help or electrical help. How do we know who to trust to come into their home to help them? Handling crises, medical emergencies, along with meal preparation and all the activities of daily living. And so this is why, folks, seriously, we want you to think about, right? Who will be there to provide care? Have you ever had a conversation in the family? Not like sit down and just drill it into someone, but conversations over a period of time about what might happen if I'm no longer able to stay in my home. Where would I go? Is it a retirement community? Is it with a child, a brother, a sister, so on and so forth? What does that look like? It's important to figure that out during or maybe even prior to the navigating longevity phase. And lastly, the phase that no one likes to think about, right? But MIT tells us that as we age longer, oftentimes aging is not a team sport. The longer we age, the more likely that we'll be spending a period of that 8,000 days by ourselves, living alone. What's interesting is, and here's some statistics. In fact, the statistic on the left side, many people, when I put it up, they're like, I can't believe that's true. The average age of widowhood in the United States is 59 years old. You say, why is that? Well, men tend to marry younger. If they marry a second or subsequent time, much younger. You'll see here on my graph, about 42% of women over age 75 are in single households, about 23% of men. Men oftentimes remarry at higher rates than women do. But again, that average age of widowhood, if we were in person today and I was talking to a group of 40 to 50 people, it would never fail that 2 or 3 people would come up to me afterwards and say, I can't believe you just said that. Let me tell you my story. So the important thing here, MIT says all of us should probably be thinking about 2 retirements. The retirement that we spend together if we're part of a couple, and the retirement that we may be spending by ourselves after the passing of a loved one, or if we find ourselves for some reason suddenly single in that retirement phase. Well, when it happens, the practical side of it is it probably sends us back into the decision boxes of one of those first 3 phases. So we may ask ourselves, do we want to go back to work? Do we have to work? Do we want to work as a source of engagement? Were we working already? Do we enjoy what we do, right? That honeymoon phase. Where do I want to spend my time? We are thrown back into that. Or maybe we're asking questions like, do I want to live in this 4,000 square foot house in the suburbs where we raise the family? Or would I rather move and be closer to family in a home that's more comfortable? Or maybe I don't want any maintenance anymore. I'm going to move into a community where all that's taken care of for me. Or thirdly, if your spouse or significant other was your primary caregiver, where will the care come from if they're not here any longer? So again, in the solo journey, social relationships are really, really important. And again, in no other case than widowhood or divorce do we see social relationships so crucially important in terms of both physical and mental health. Being able to say, or people who do say, I'm sometimes or often lonely, just to give you the research, researchers say it's about the physical and cognitive effect of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness is an epidemic and something we all should be aware of. And the way to combat that is being intentional about maintaining social activity and social networks. Well, folks, I don't want to leave you in the dumps because those last 2 phases, they're a little bit of a bummer. So I want to share with you my favorite slide in the whole deck. It's called the age you peak at everything. So let me explain how this works. All the numbers on that scale correspond to a particular age at which you peak in the milestones that are listed. So I'll show you how this works. Let's say you're worried these days because you can't remember names anymore. Provided you're over age 22, that's perfectly normal because we peak at remembering names at age 22. But you say, I can't even remember faces anymore. Relax, as long as you're over 32. 32 is the age at which we peak at remembering faces, so on and so forth. So if, like me, you're over age 40, sorry, folks, we missed out on our opportunity to make a Nobel Prize winning discovery. But the reason why I put this graph up is there's a very important data point that repeats twice on the graph. You all see it? It's life satisfaction. Life satisfaction peaks first at age 23. Now, I want you to get in the time machine if you need to. Go back to age 23. You may not have had very many obligations. You might not have had very much money, but you had all the time in the world and you had your health. Set your sails, off you go. World's your oyster. And if you screw it up today, Monday's coming soon enough. Very enjoyable time of our life. If you're wondering, I didn't put it on the slide, but the lowest points of life satisfaction are between ages 45 and 52. Why then? Well, everybody wants a part of your time. Work has constant demands. You're trying to figure out how to get the kids out of the nest, pay for college. You're adjusting to a new lifestyle. It's mayhem good news in your early 50s, that starts to turn around and life satisfaction again peaks at age 69. Why does it peak at age 69? Well, the sociologists say you're probably your highest average of those three resources I talked about: your physical health, your financial health, and you're socially connected in your communities. Hey, folks, more good news. Happiness with your body peaks at age 74. I guess by then you say, well, I've been playing with this deck of cards my whole life, right? Up till age 73. Guess not going to change. So maybe it's more acceptance than happiness. But happiness with your body peaks at age 74. And remember, I told you, look, as you age, you may be providing care for another, you may be living single, you may be transitioning in terms of housing. Important to know, psychological well-being, defined as tomorrow will be better than today, continues to increase, usually into our early 80s. Why is that? Because mortality has us become more reflective, and it gets us to focus our time, our finances, and our talents on the things that we believe are most meaningful in life, which aids that psychological well-being. In our early 80s, oftentimes we'll have our first major medical incident, which can begin to detract from that. So the age you peak at everything, there's more good things to look forward to as life continues to extend in terms of the number of years and longevity. So how does this make a difference? Well, let me give you a little analogy to think about. Let's say that instead of talking for the past however many minutes on retirement and MIT and all that stuff, let's say you had a puzzle sitting in front of you, and our job over this past 45 minutes or so is to put that puzzle together. If that were the job, what would you say is the most important first step? Now, when I ask audiences, most people will say corners, straight edges. Some people won't answer because they'll say, he's going to say something dumb like flip the pieces over or something. Well, it is a trick question, right? And all those steps are important, but the most important first step is to take a look at the picture on the box, right? Step back and think about, what does my picture look like? What will I be doing in the future? After we answer those questions, what the picture on the box looks like, then we can begin to evaluate the pieces that we've collected and make them fit together. So the big thing to understand here, how much will retirement cost, is kind of what the question has been up to this point. But now the relevant question, which includes how much will retirement cost, is what will I be doing? All those questions I just asked you: where will I be living? Will I be working? What's my role with other family members, children, grandchildren, parents, siblings, so on and so forth? What are the hobbies? What are all those things I intend to do? And then we can work backwards to evaluate the pieces that we've collected. The difficult thing about this analysis is, at least at this point, technology isn't exactly helpful. When we looked at retirees and the conversations that they wanted to have with all advisors, whether they were medical advisors, legal advisors, so on and so forth, the answer we consistently heard back is that my life is not an algorithm, right? We desire personalization and empathy. I want to talk to an advisor who understands me. Again, whether it's legal, health, financial. I want them to know who I am, where I came from, what I'm trying to do and accomplish, and pumping a few numbers into a spreadsheet to try and get an output. Not exactly the personal, empathetic kind of conversation that we wish to have. So folks, we need to sit down and think about that picture on our box. Let me just share with you, I think the most underestimated aspect of working with competent advisors is not the investment piece. We already expect that, right? We wouldn't be in their office if we didn't think they had the competence and access to resources that would allow them to generate really, really solid investment returns for us. But what we're really hoping to hear is, what are some of the insights, right? Advisors have helped many people through many similar type transitions. No two transitions are exactly the same, but being able to share the insight and the knowledge, being able to say, I worked with a client who had similar questions to what you had. And let me tell you what I think they learned over the process. Here's a couple of things that they probably wouldn't have done it this way if they had to do it all over again, or here's a couple of things that they wouldn't have changed. That aspect of thinking about your relationship with your financial advisor, crucially important, just as crucial, I think, is evaluating all the pieces that you collect. So folks, we talked about 8,000 days, kind of those 4 segments, remember? And the key is that last segment, that was never intended to last as long as it does, and trying to figure out that the retirement that was designed as solely rest, relaxation, and recreation, that usually lasts, that satisfies for 5 to 7 years. I would argue one of the biggest issues now is finding new purpose and new sense of meaning in those extended years. We talked about the 4 phases of retirement. Remember, honeymoon phase, big decision phase, navigating longevity, and living solo. And then really sitting down, taking a deep breath, stepping back and thinking about what the picture on your box looks like, and working with your advisor based on that vision to come back to the right portfolio, the right kind of vehicles to help you get done what you'd like to get done. Dr. Coughlin puts it this way as I close up my comments: the 4 phases of retirement enable a clear vision to plan and anticipate what's likely to come. And here's the key: effective preparation reduces the stress and boosts prolonged independence, which I think is what we're all looking for. How do I remain independent as long as I can? Proper preparation is key to that. And hopefully the 8,000-day framework helps us think through some of those things. I'll end with a favorite quote of mine from my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, who famously said, "The future ain't what it used to be." We wholeheartedly agree. And so, as I mentioned earlier, if you weren't here to hear the very beginning, we have a 4-page white paper that we'll be happy to share with you. It's a summary of the presentation that I gave today, written by Dr. Coughlin, who's the founder and director of the MIT Age Lab, so that you might take it, reflect back on what we talked about today, or maybe share it with family and friends who may need to think about some of these topics as they continue their journey through the aging process as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Jack ask, if any questions came in, or if you had any as we went through. I'd be happy to answer any or think about them any way I could.
Yeah, I think it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. One of the main themes that I was getting from your presentation was how important knowledge is. And what you said, we're in this knowledge era. So I guess the question for me, and hopefully I can at some point help some clients out with this, what are 1 or 2 things that people can do in retirement, or 1 or 2 ways that they can keep their minds sharp? I think that's one of the most important things. And from secondhand family matters, that's definitely what I've seen as most important. So how do you reflect on that?
Yeah, so it has to do with that social component, Jack. It has to do with becoming intentionally involved in things, hopefully in things you're like. A lot of people, when they retire, don't want to become involved in things because they fear that level of commitment, right? Well, maybe there are things that we can find that do involve some commitment, but not maybe the kind of commitment that we're so anxious about. Because here's the problem. Well, there was a book written by a Harvard sociologist named Robert Putnam. Maybe some of our listeners are familiar with it. It was titled Bowling Alone. It was written some years ago, and it talked about how more Americans are playing the game of bowling than ever before in history, but fewer are joining leagues. So when we look at our civic associations, right, whether they're religious institutions or local service organizations, they've really taken some hits over the years. And these are typically the places people would have turned for social interaction. Whatever it is you intend to do, and that's why I always say, find a cause, if nothing else, find a cause you believe in. When we ask about, donation, I'm not just talking about who do you give money to, what are the causes that are emotionally connected to you? And then trying to find others who are interested in the same thing. I can't stress enough. Relationships, relationships, relationships. In fact, sociologists say, Jack, we all need a third place. What's a third place? First place is your family, the relationships in your family. Second place is oftentimes the workplace and the relationships we have there. A third place is a place in our community. Could be a dog walk, could be a park, could be a library, could be a restaurant, a bar, whatever it is, where we develop some social connection with people. Maybe we see people routinely on a regular basis, but at the same time, there's a fresh influx of people that may represent new potential social connections that will keep us young. And to that point, one of the things you can do, Jack, as you age, is make sure you integrate younger people into your social network. Because by integrating younger people into the network, you virtually guarantee that you won't outlive your social network. And I don't know if you've ever met anyone who's ever said, I lost everyone around me that made life worth living. That's not a good place to be. So maintaining those social relationships are good for you physically, especially good for you emotionally and mentally.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I have a feeling that's one of the reasons that I'm at the firm. I'm 24, so
There you
keep
go.
social circles young, I suppose.
You still
Uh,
have your Nobel Prize in front of you then.
there you go. There you go. 1 year past peak happiness, at
Yeah. It's all
24.
downhill. All
You know,
downhill till
I
69. Well,
look
early 50s.
looking forward to it. Um, we didn't have any questions in the chat, but if people can feel free to unmute and ask any questions they might have. But just to recap the chat a little bit, we will be sending out the white paper, that 4-page white paper. I believe we already have it, with the recording that needs to go out. So you can also feel free to request it from myself. It's just my email is jack.freedman@bickling.com, or reach out to any one of your advisors and they will forward the email to any one of us that are in this webinar today. But if
Jack, I'll also mention if people are interested, you can always Google the MIT Age Lab, or I believe it's agelab at mit.edu. And on their website, you can actually volunteer to be a research associate, and participate in some of their surveys and things like that if you're open to doing something like that.
That's right. And if you're ever in Cambridge, keep an eye out for that MIT Age Lab car. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.